have white ancestry, some level of white ancestry. And when you think about it, it's almost obvious. You know, when you see blacks in America, and then you look at blacks from the west coast of Africa, they don't really look the same. There's a racial, the racial mixing has been going on here for over 400 years. And it's really something that I found inspiring. It really gives the message that we're all connected. We're all connected to a brotherhood of community. And these divisions, be it state divisions, be it religious divisions, be it race divisions, are really artificial religions. We're all mutts, and we're all really interrelated. And you see that when you go back a few generations, that really blacks are whites and whites are blacks. You know, we all share the same blood. So anyway, Stephen Smith was born here, and he sold off into General Bowd's lumber yard at 5 years old. And the story that's really inspiring about Stephen Smith is he's in this lumber yard for a few weeks, and his mother shows up. His mother then runs away from the plantation, his black mother, and she wants to be with her 5-year-old son. I mean, imagine having your 5-year-old being torn away from you, being sold. And, you know, her mommy alarms are going off. I want to be with my son. So she runs away to this General Bowd's lumber yard here in Columbia, Pennsylvania. And General Bowd sees her and says, of course you can stay with me here with your son, and he's benevolent to keep this family together. Well, about 2 weeks later, the slave owners here in Maryland come up to this plantation. Their name was Cochran, and the woman, the female Mrs. Cochran, comes up in a wagon and says, listen, Nancy Smith, you know, the mother of Stephen Smith, you need to come with me. I sold Stephen Smith. I didn't sell you. You need to come back to the plantation. You're in trouble. Nancy Smith says, no, I'm not leaving my son. And she stands up for her, you know, her dignity and wants to be with her family. Well, a fight breaks out between the Mrs. Cochran, and Nancy Smith. And Stephen Smith runs and gets General Bowd. He comes in, he intercedes, and he swishes away Nancy Cochran. And General Bowd then buys Nancy Smith, Stephen Smith's mother, and they live happily, you know, actually happily ever after, but they live together on the General Bowd's lumberyard. This is speculation, but Stephen Smith is 5 years old and an impressionable young man, and sees his mother stand up to this institution. Stephen Smith later on in life becomes the richest black man in the United States. He's a very powerful individual. He owns over 300 properties here in Philadelphia. What he does is he gets into the lumber and coal business, and the train tracks start to be laid down around this time. Train travel starts to happen. And he starts having a shipping network between Columbia and Philadelphia with coal and lumber. And what Stephen Smith does is that he helped hundreds, maybe thousands of runaways. The runaways would come up, they would know about Stephen Smith here on the Underground Railroad. He would hide him in his house and then put him in false bottoms on the train cars to come over here to Philadelphia. And then a man by the name of William Still would pick him up in Philadelphia and send him on the way, you know, off to the Underground Railroad. So Stephen Smith, he was living right on the border of free slave, harboring runaway slaves at the risk of being arrested, tortured. You know, the analogy I think I talk about in the book is, you can talk about American democratic values here. You know, that's one thing. But stand in Baghdad and live there and start waving the American flag, that's a whole nother situation. Stephen Smith lived on the front lines and assisted thousands of runaways. He was, as I said, he was the wealthiest black man. He really financed all of these abolition movements that happened here. I talk about this in the book too. The story that you get in history class is that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Well, when Abraham Lincoln gave his Emancipation Proclamation, he freed the slaves in the South. not in the North, not on the border states. It would be almost like Obama saying, you Cubans don't have to pay taxes. Well, Obama doesn't have the authority to, and Lincoln didn't have the authority to free the slaves that he freed. They were in the Confederacy. What Lincoln was really saying was, he was telling the people in slavery in the South, look, if you run up north, we're going to get you a meal, a gun, and a uniform. We're going to point you back to the plantations to free. We've got a whole new crop of troops. That was the message of the Gettysburg Address. And really what happens when blacks enlist into the Union, that's when the tide of the war changes. Then the Union starts to win the war, with the black. You don't really get that history here. And people like Stephen Smith, who helped all of these runaways to freedom, really pragmatically dismantled the institution of slavery. It wasn't going to hold up any longer. It's almost like today when you have the Mexicans who come over working here. There's like 20 million Mexicans. What are you going to do now? You're going to arrest 20 million people? You can't really do that. That's what Stephen Smith had done. There were so many runaways who would come up north, it wasn't going to be fixed. You weren't going to be able to repair it. And the Civil War was a response to that, because Southern plantation owners tried to grab their property back. And the Northern courts were saying, no, they're free. You can't have it back. And that was really what played, what had the Civil War, was the trigger. So really, in my view, doing this research, which I didn't really set out to, I was looking for the Queen Christina portrait. But when I saw it, you see that these people lived incredible lives. They were incredibly brave and incredibly tough, and really dismantled slavery. These are the people who really are the heroes of the United States. The United States was really being torn apart at this point in time. Slavery was this artificial institution that wasn't going to exist for that much longer. There were too many biracial people around. Blacks were painting portraits. They could speak multiple languages. There were rebellions. It was tearing the country apart. It was going to end at one time or another. These guys brought it to a crux by, helping all these runaways. And really, Stephen Smith is a national hero, no question about it. Sure. Right?
Isn't slavery still going on today, though?
Yeah, that's a great question. Today, there are more slaves in the world than there has ever been. Not on a per capita basis, but there are more slaves throughout the world. It's mostly in the sex trade and that type of thing. But slavery is a very disturbing, we have this tendency about human beings wanting to enslave each other. It's disturbing. Yeah.
But like the slavery, you said by but isn't the slavery like located anywhere else besides the USA?
Yes. When I talk about slavery in America at this point in time, I'm talking about a slave society where it's a legalized institution that the government runs. It's not that somebody's repressing a particular individual behind the scenes, running an illicit sex trade operation or something. It's a government-sanctioned, taxed, count them, it's a government institution. It's a slave society. And America was really a slave society for as long as the United States has been a country. So, slavery started back in the 1600s here. And it was an institution for a few hundred years before the United States even started. And then it was an institution in the country for another 150 years or something before it went away. Oh, you have a question?
These biracial groups, were they considered outcasts? Were they discriminated against by the rest of society? How were they viewed?
That's a great question. Because the slavery went on for so long, 200 years, I really saw everything with biracial unions. I saw people that looked like they were in love and were living in a repressed society and hiding their children and trying to live a life underneath the radar and trying to exist. I also saw things like slave breeding. I saw white slave masters taking black female slaves and just getting crops of slaves, but selling off their own flesh.
Now in those days,
and everything in between those two extremes, I saw.
In those days, was it illegal for, let's say, a white man to marry a black woman? was illegal, wasn't it?
It depended upon what state you were in.
Okay.
Yeah. Here, actually, the first case in Philadelphia in this region was a white man who married a black woman.